Okay, I'd like to start by having each of the panelists introduce themselves, and maybe we can begin with Saffron.
Hi, my name is Saffron, and I am an ulcerative colitis patient, and I'm the director of the film Designer Shit documentary, which is about fecal transplant and my experience with DIY fecal transplant.
Okay, thank you. Ted?
Hi, my name's Ted Steiner. I'm an adult infectious disease specialist and a clinician scientist. So in my clinical practice, I do stool transplants routinely for recurrent C. difficile infection. And I've also been heavily engaged in research with Crohn's and Colitis Canada at basic science level and also clinical research level. So I'm very happy to be here and flattered that you invited me.
Thank you. Bria?
My name is Bria. I am a volunteer with Connecting to Cure Crohn's and Colitis. We're an organization based in Los Angeles, California. We offer patient and caregiver support groups, and we do a lot of fundraising for research and some other programming. I just want to say, when I was asked to join the panel today, I readily agreed, and then I promptly freaked out. I have been a passionate advocate behind closed doors since my Crohn's diagnosis 16 years ago. But that's the first time I've said that out loud in front of strangers. So I was a bit nervous, but I have an incredibly supportive network of IBD patients and friends, and I wouldn't be here today without them. And so it's because of them and for them that I'm talking out loud today. So I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for joining us. That's really wonderful. And Kate?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kate. I'm the Vice President of Research and Patient Programs at Crohn's and Colitis Canada. My title doesn't say it, but I'm also in charge of advocacy. So basically our mission activities at our organization. We're a health charity. We've been around for almost 50 years, started by concerned parents in the 1970s. Where imagine back in those days, there really wasn't much known about Crohn's or colitis. So group of parents who really felt that they needed to do something about it since their children were suffering and decided to form this organization to initially 100% find the cures. And now we're there to not only support research to find the cures, but also to offer support. So we have education programs, we have support programs, and we also advocate along with supporting IBD scientists such as Dr. Ted Steiner to really find the cures eventually for Crohn's or colitis. And thank you again for inviting me as well.
Great. Well, thank you. So prior to the early 80s, there was no such thing as the internet. When you came down with a set of symptoms, you could not Google it to find out what the possible causes were. When your doctor prescribed you medication, you couldn't go home and research what the possible side effects were going to be. And if you received a diagnosis, you couldn't find out what the prognosis was. And you were really had no other way of connecting with other people who shared your illness. So there was obviously a knowledge imbalance. Fast forward to 2023, patients now have the ability to do their own research. They can connect with other people who are going through exactly the same experience as them. And when they go to their doctor now, they very often have done extensive research and come prepared with a long list of questions. So doctors have had to adjust to this knowledge shift. And now there's a need to be prepared when their patients come in determined to find out the answers that they have researched on the internet. Doctors also have to be prepared to be able to explain to patients if the information they have found is good information, is it supported through research, or is it information that holds no credibility? So I think that this is a fascinating topic because we've got representation here from a medical doctor, from patients, and from patient advocacy organizations who really try to bridge the gap between those two. So I'd like to begin with Saffron. Saffron, you underwent a fecal transplant on your own without your doctor's support. And it was at a time before there was a lot of information in the media about fecal transplants. Now there is a lot of information, people are finding out about it, but back 10 years ago, how did you initially find out about this potential new therapy?
So about 15 years ago, when I was diagnosed with colitis, there was an article in the Toronto Star about a guy who had severe Crohn's colitis. He did DIY fecal transplant with his mother as his donor, and he had this miraculous recovery. So it was an article that somebody sent me. I was freshly diagnosed. I thought, that's interesting. I had no interest in doing that myself. But it was something I kind of kept in the back of my mind. Being just diagnosed, I was just put on medication. It was working really well for me. I had no need to do something like a fecal transplant. And then as the years went by, I kind of went through periods of remission and flare as this disease goes. And with each flare, the medication I was on, the dosage was upped. And then it was, let's try a round of steroids and then go back to your medication and see if that works. So each time I felt like my condition got a little bit worse, I would research alternatives. So I'd say, okay, let's try the steroids, but let's also try a new diet. Let's try the steroids, but let's also look into supplementation. And the fecal transplant was always at the back of my mind. I was always just kind of Googling it, researching it, following the McMaster University trial that was going on, but also finding anecdotes on the internet in support groups and forums of people who were doing this themselves. And I did that for about 10 years before I ever thought of doing it myself. So it was a long period of research and just kind of curiosity.
Okay. And at what point did you talk to your physician about it?
I had been speaking to my physician about it for years. I think every appointment I brought it up, I would kind of say, oh, are you following what's going on at McMaster University? And he would say, no, not really. He didn't really have an interest in it. So I would always bring it up and the conversation wouldn't really go anywhere. So I kind of knew from the beginning, if this is something I want to do, he's not going to be the person to help me. He wasn't even offering to, introduce me to the people running the trial. So yeah, I brought it up a lot, but it wasn't really going anywhere.
Okay. So Ted, I wanted to ask you a question. There is a scene at the beginning of the film in which Saffron says to her gastrointestinal doctor, he says to her, well, your knife's not really compromised, is it? And in the film, she reflects to herself on the fact that, yes, in fact, her life is compromised. How did that scene hit you, being a medical doctor yourself? And when we talk about the knowledge balance, is there an obligation on the doctor's part in this new world that we live in to try to understand the patient's perspective and to try to be accommodating to the fact that they have found out about new therapies and spend time explaining to them whether they're available, whether they're not available, why they might not be a good match for them?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. First I want to say, Saffron, just to thank you for sharing your story and the amazing work that you did in the film. It was, I was skeptical when I was first reached out to. It was like, oh, what is this movie going to be about? And then I watched it. I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I've recommended it to a lot of patients and colleagues. So just thank you for that. Anyway, moving on to the question, I could talk about it for an hour, but I agree. So, I totally agree that that everything that I do with the patient has to be shared decision making. The only exception being people who are not capable of providing their own consent, and then then we do shared decision making with their family member, whoever their decision maker is. But in some ways that's a luxury that I have because I don't make most of my money from seeing patients. I have an academic career, so when I go to clinic, I can take an hour for each new patient and take the time to answer all of their questions. And that, that's a challenge because I do have a waiting list because that sort of limits availability. But I know that gastroenterologists, because it's a procedural specialty, very often do not have that luxury. So I'm not trying to make excuses for your physician. I just recognize the reality of it. And also if I'm having a bad day or I'm falling behind or I'm rushed, it's much more challenging for me to take the time and do that. But in some ways, patients are consumers of the healthcare system, and we have to treat them as such. But just more importantly, people need to be listened to, and you need to acknowledge their level of scientific education and understanding, and also try to appreciate their motivations. I mean, I will say that it gets easier the older I get. You just get more experience and hopefully a little more wisdom, but it's not easy. And also, some people, don't have the personality that allows them to demonstrate that kind of empathy. I mean, I believe there's room in medicine for all types. You can choose a specialty that suits your personality type, but I do, yeah, I did cringe a little bit at that scene.
Okay, thank you. Brian, can you tell us about the relationships that you've experienced with your doctors, and have you experienced something similar to Saffron, or has your experience been different?
I'll be honest, I've never had an experience like Saffron's. In fact, if I did, I think I'd seek out new doctors, and not in a shopping around for doctors kind of way, just my personality, like you're saying, it matters with the doctor and if we vibe together. And that's been something that has been so important to me from day one of my diagnosis, that I have a very comfortable and collaborative experience with my doctors. Yeah.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. So Kate, I want to throw a question out to you. So in the film, we see Saffron trying to talk to her gastroenterologist about fecal transplants. And she's obviously done enough research on it to know that people are doing it, and it has showed promise for her condition. But her doctor didn't offer her a lot of information and left her hanging. So as a patient advocacy organization, I'm interested in how this hit you. Is this typically what you hear from your members?
I do have to agree with Ted. When I saw that scene, it's a tough one, because Saffron, I felt so much for you. And by the way, for the folks in the audience, you should watch Designer Shit. I loved it. I thought it was very informative and very balanced. So, on the evidence side versus your perspective, Saffron, it's a tough one. And I think it's because I'd love to say that we've progressed with time. And I think we have, like to Bria's point, she herself would probably seek another specialist. And I think we're getting more and more patients feeling empowered to do that, because they're seeking their information. As you said, Brenda, there's more, it's easier for them to look for that information pre-internet years or whatnot. Having said that, I know one of the things that Ted mentioned is gastroenterologists. One of the things that I hear often, actually consistently from our gastroenterologists, one that they themselves struggle with is they know they have limited time with each of their patients. So it's unfortunate. And they themselves say, I wish I could spend more time with my patients, but I can't, because I have to make time for my next patients and so forth. And this goes beyond just the gastroenterologists, but I also hear this from the IBD nurses who are at the hospitals. So I think it's a balancing game, if you will. And so I think the best course of action and the solution that we can work with right now, which actually CCC has done its best to try to develop to support patients, is it's in the chat box, is we developed a discussion guide. So one based on patient input primarily, in terms of, and also the clinicians in terms of what do they need to learn from the patient to really see how their quality of life has been affected by their disease course in between doctor's visit. So based on that feedback, we developed a discussion guide, and hopefully that'll help for folks. Maybe not Saffron, because I think Saffron, you're very proactive when you go in your film. It looks like you go and really prepared for your appointments. But a lot of patients, unfortunately, they don't do that still. So I think the key is for you to make the most efficient use of that 10 minutes you might have with your gastroenterologist, and come prepared with all your questions. It's not doctors, they may not have the answers for you. And I think you did the right thing, Saffron. You went elsewhere for that. But, at the end of the day, and maybe Ted can speak to this, doctors are there to, they follow the clinical practice guidelines and whatnot. And if the evidence is not there yet for Health Canada to approve it, the doctors are not allowed, by the way, our healthcare system, to prescribe that to their patients. And I'm assuming, Saffron, that's the situation your gastroenterologist faced, that it wasn't Health Canada approved, and it wasn't at that stage yet where he could have that productive discussion with you. And good for you that you sought out other information beyond that to see whether it was right for you.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, and I'd like to hear from everybody on that, because I do think, Kate, that there's a difference between prescribing something and having a conversation with a patient who clearly has spent a lot of time, and not everybody is as capable. I mean, Saffron obviously was doing even more research than usual because she was researching for her documentary film. However, I think we've all been in that situation. I've certainly been in that situation where I'm quite capable of, doing the legwork. I understand that a physician is not compensated for his time in doing research for every single individual patient. But if I come in, and I'm going to throw this one to Ted first, if I come in as a patient, and I have clearly done a considerable amount of research, is it, and it's not a prescribed treatment yet, how is it not should the doctor not at least engage in a conversation? Because Kate, what you're kind of alluding to is the fact that it's not allowed, therefore we're not going to discuss it. Where does the discussing it come in? Because patients are allowed to make their own decisions to a certain extent, right? I mean, not to a certain extent, to a whole extent. It's their body, their decision. So like what should the doctor's responsibility be, Ted, in ensuring that it's not shut down and that there's a conversation that pursues?
Yeah, I agree. When people come to me with ideas and suggestions, I always address them because that's important. And I try to address them based on the evidence. And that situation comes up all the time. I think the only limit that we're appropriately allowed to set is not to prescribe a medication that we feel is not medically indicated for a patient. But with FMT, it's something people can do themselves, obviously. And I've explained that to patients. I said there are lots of resources available on the internet. I cannot provide it to you for these reasons. But if you chose to do it yourself, and something happened, in other words, I'm not abandoning you as a patient if you choose to do it yourself, by any means. But I just am not allowed to. I also feel like it's a bit unfair to say like, oh, here's this potentially life-saving treatment. I can't do it for you. Go do it yourself. So I always try to discuss the evidence. I mean, and that was something that actually we faced, for C. diff probably 10 years ago when there was no Health Canada approval and people were kind of doing it under the table, or, I was lucky enough to be able to join a clinical trial that Christine Lee had written. And that was the only way that I was able to make the treatment available at the time. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree. And also, I mean, I do have people come to me, they've researched things on the internet that are just clearly wrong. And I take the time to explain gently, why they're wrong. Nobody likes to feel like an idiot either, right? So you have to walk that line, but at the same time, there is a point where you have to set a firm limit.
And do you ever think we'll get to a point, and obviously you're Canadian, there's Americans on this call, where insurance companies recognize that there is a payment required for the time spent? Because I think right now the medical payment model is very much treatment focused. It's like you get in there, there's no compensation for doctors that maybe go away from seeing their patients and do that extra research on their own and bring it back. Is that something, Ted, that you think would ever happen in Canada? And Brian, maybe you can address it from the States' point of view.
Actually, So right now, I don't get compensated at all for doing FMTs, and in fact, for screening and preparing the stool, I pay out of sort of leftover research money from industry studies. It's not a lot, but but my personal uh, practice group at my hospital is actually salaried. We have a not salaried. It's a practice plan. So basically, we get a certain amount of money to run the program, and in the next contract, we're actually going to put in some money to cover the costs of doing this. I know other places where physicians charge patients directly, and say, yes, come and do this. You bring a check for $1,000 or whatever it is, and I don't feel like that's appropriate in the Canadian system where we have universal payer. But at some point, having to lose money to do it is not ultimately sustainable. So we are working on that, and I think but it comes down to the way that physician compensation is handled in Canada, which is province by province as opposed to federal. So it's complicated, and some places it works better than others. And honestly, having patient voices speak up about it is probably the most helpful thing.
Okay, that's great. Ryan, what's your experience in the States? Do you get a sense that it would improve if there was a fee for conversation, a fee for going back and doing additional research? Is that anything that you believe the insurance carriers are looking at?
I can't really speak to what the insurance companies are up to these days. I do know as a patient, and the doctors might not appreciate this, but I would never let myself feel rushed in an appointment. When I go and I have questions, I am taking all the time I need to make sure that my questions are answered. It maybe isn't the best attitude, but I go in there thinking they work for me, and I will take all the time I need to feel comfortable with whatever we're discussing, whatever decision we're making. That's kind of my philosophy. I don't ever want to take up too much of anybody's time, but I am seeking collaborative relationships with my doctors. So there have definitely been times when I've asked for more information, and I'm very careful about, not going to resources online that are, nonsense or incorrect, like you were saying, Ted. And so like asking for those resources so that I can go home and do good scientific backed research on my own and then discuss with my doctor later. But as far as the compensation model goes, I can't really speak to that. I would like it to be a smoother experience on both sides. I know that would make it easier for everybody, but I'm not a fan of the insurance companies.
Yeah, okay. So Kate, I know that the Crohn's Colitis Canada is very selective about information that you make available to your members. Can you speak a little bit about how that is determined, what you share, and who makes those decisions?
Sure, happy to. So I don't know. So maybe I can just go over the process, because I'm not quite sure in terms of the word selective. We're not, basically the information that we share is determined by the needs and of our patient community. So we conduct surveys. We're very connected to the Crohn's and colitis community across Canada. And so based on a combination of national surveys, as well as high touch points where we meet them face to face at events and so forth, we collect all of that data and hear from them in terms of what are their priorities, what are their needs. And beyond the standard, what is IBD, those types of questions that, of course, we would educate folks on. In terms of special information, if you will, those are the things that's really determined by a patient and caregiver community. Now, what information we share with that is based on evidence. So we do we do collect. So we work very closely with our clinician and research community across Canada, where we would develop the content, working with them to ensure that it's accurate. And so in that sense, we are selective in that we might talk about some unproven methods, and we do talk about it and we do share information on that, but we make it clear that the research evidence is uncertain. That would be something that we would say to to ensure that the folks who are reading that content know that this is there, this is something that's considered within our community, but the research evidence is not fully supportive yet. So FMT will be an example where we have education content. We've run webinars such as this with invited expert speakers where they talk about the latest evidence and so forth, because it's something that our audience would like, and it's something that is being tested right now, but it's made very clear from a research perspective where it stands.
Okay. And Brian, how about your organization? How do you handle information that you share with your members who, again, are all patients with Crohn's and colitis?
Team to Cure's approach is actually really non-medical. We offer a lot of different programs for patients and caregivers. And while we do a lot of fundraising for research, we kind of seek to be more of a social and emotional support vehicle for our patients and caregivers. But with that being said, we do always encourage our patients and caregivers to advocate for themselves, speak up for themselves, to educate themselves in a safe way without, going down rabbit holes and finding nonsense. We're always very wary of the word cure. We don't want anyone seeking, mumbo jumbo online, but again, just encouraging people to find the right doctors and caregiver team for them individually, whatever that might mean, and advocating for themselves. That's more of our focus.
Okay. So I'm going to stick with that because I know that you oversee patient support and that you are involved in some patient forums. Can you talk a little bit about what your approach is? And I'm assuming that you run your own patient forum groups. Maybe you participate in others. I'd love to hear from Saffron about her experience with patient forums, and of course from Ted and Kate as well, because patient forums, of course, are groups of individuals who have been diagnosed with similar conditions. But I don't know whether there's any input within those forums from the medical community. And so, I would like to hear everybody's sort of opinion on the pros and cons of those forums that the internet has allowed us to create. So we'll start with you, Brian.
We don't do too many, I don't do too many patient forums so much as our patient support groups. And again, we're just really encouraging everyone to advocate for themselves, speaking up for themselves, and to take the time that they need to feel good about whatever decisions they're making. I apologize, I've got some noise in the background, so I'm going to pass it to the next one.
Saffron, I know that you, I believe you used to participate in a lot of them in the depth of your illness. And did you find them helpful? Did you find them not helpful?
A bit of both. Yeah, I used to seek out forums a lot when I was like at my worst, feeling really sick, when I was really curious about fecal transplant. I was following the research. I was looking at the evidence from every clinical trial for fecal transplant for my condition, but I was also finding anecdotal stories on these forums. And on the forums, I was seeing both sides, actually. The forums would kind of police themselves in a way, that you had some people who were telling their stories about how fecal transplant worked. You had an equal number of patients who were jumping in to say, you guys are idiots, you're not following the research. So they would be debated. And, some days I feel like I would go on the forums and find support or the bit of information that I needed. Some days I would walk away feeling worse because I heard from a lot of naysayers who were Crohn's colitis patients saying things like, you're never going to get better, get over it. So they're good and bad. But at that time, I didn't know anybody in my personal life who was suffering from colitis. It was nice to speak to people who were going through what I was going through.
But at that time, you were also heavily researching fecal transplants and your disease. Did you find that forums served at any point as a breeding ground for misinformation?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people can jump in with misinformation, but like I said, they were kind of policed themselves. Like there were a lot of very well educated Crohn's and colitis patients on those forums as well, who would kind of jump in with and provide clinical trial research and links to things disproving what somebody would say. So you have to go into it with critical thinking. But there are a lot of critical thinkers on those forums. You just have to kind of be able to decipher for yourself.
And Ted, have you had any involvement with forums? Like, have you ever made a recommendation, for example, for a patient to participate, or have any patients ever said to you, "Oh, I'm on this forum and it's giving me this information"? Has there ever been any concerns? Or do doctors participate in these forums to go in as to provide some information while people are chatting about things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, well, first of all, when I see people who are recently diagnosed, or maybe not even recently, with IBD, I always refer them to Crohn's Colitis Canada, for the patient facing assistance. I think it's incredible. And I agree with Saffron that that knowing other people with the same condition, I think is probably very helpful and supportive. I mean, I haven't participated in any forums per se, but I certainly have a lot of patients who have and have come back to me and said, "Hey, I heard about this. What do you think? I heard about this. What do you think?" And I encourage that. I mean, I want people to be as educated as they possibly can be about their condition. And honestly, the biggest challenge or downside of that is people with underlying anxiety disorders, particularly health anxiety, can be triggered a lot by these discussions, and it can make them feel worse. And that's not something that I have expertise or training in how to manage. So it's that makes it really tough. And just being there and showing empathy and trying to provide factual information is helpful, but it doesn't fix the problem, and that does create frustration. But I think on balance, I think these forums and patient groups are helpful more than they're not.
Okay. Kate, what's your thoughts on it? And is your association involved in hosting any forums?
We are. So we have Facebook, and that's still active and live. And it's one actually that our staff monitor. And so to the point of misinformation, and Saffron, I personally don't monitor it, but this is certainly to your experience about there is misinformation there, but some of the folks who are on those platforms are very well informed. So there's that ongoing conversation amongst each other, and that balances it out, I think. And I think that's what we experience with our Facebook platform. But I would say as well, what we do with the one that we manage is that if we do see misinformation, it's an opportunity for us to provide the information there. So our staff does provide links and so forth if people are interested in learning more about it. We also do offer support programs. So both the one-on-one matching, Saffron, for example, if you had come to us when you were first diagnosed and you said, "I'd like to speak to someone who, as you see, who's in my similar situation," we'd find a volunteer, because we do have a roster of volunteers who want to help others who might be facing a similar situation. So we would have matched you up with someone with a similar experience, so you could have that discussion with them. There's also group support, I guess similar to yours, Brian, to your group, where we do offer both in-person and virtual group support, and that is facilitated either by a staff member or, more often than not, a trained volunteer who's personally affected by Crohn's and colitis. So I think there is a place for forums, absolutely. But the biggest fear for me is the misinformation with those forums. And so because, like, unlike you, Saffron, you're very well informed. I know you do your research and so forth, but there are folks who will not necessarily do that. They just take it for granted what people say on those forums are true. And we've conducted focus groups where some people have said that. And then they take action based on what they hear from peers and so forth. And that's the part that, how do we deal with that?
Yeah. Very, very, very good points. So I want to talk a little bit about alternative treatment options, because FMT fits into that if it's done for anything other than C. diff. But in general, and I'm going to start with Ted, most medical doctors only support treatment options that have strong research supporting them, obviously. Yet other practitioners, like naturopathic doctors, are not as stringent. Many patients, and more all the time, are turning to naturopathic doctors because they feel that their medical doctor is not open to alternative treatments. What do you think about that shift that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen the data in terms of whether that's actually increasing or not. So it's interesting. I believe you. We're not trained in the principles of naturopathic medicine. I try to work with patients, and I've even spoken about patients with their naturopathic practitioners to sort of, see, hey, what can we do to help out with this? I mean, I'm a natural skeptic, and so for me, it's easy to say, like, I'm not going to do this if there's no evidence. But you also have to recognize the things that you can't study. Like the classic example is no one's going to do a randomized controlled trial of whether or not parachutes protect you when you skydive. So there, I didn't make that up, but and especially in infectious diseases, a lot of what we do is a lot of what we look at is rare, and there are some conditions where we just have to be satisfied that we're never going to get the level of evidence that cardiologists have for their conditions. And so so you end up having to I think the best thing to do is to confess your ignorance and say, hey, I don't know anything about this. If it's helping you, great. I mean, at the end of the day, I just want people to feel better. There's another quote that I didn't make up, which is that physicians view death as the enemy. And so you have to kind of remind yourself and exercise some humility, I think. So that's kind of my approach, but it can be tough.
Yeah. Kate, how's Crohn's colitis handle that? Do you have representation on your advisory board with naturopaths? Because a lot of the treatment recommendations that they make, probably not harmful, but may not have a significant amount of research to validate them. So
Yeah.
what's your association's approach on that?
We have patient representation on our SMAC, but we do not have a naturopath on our SMAC. And right to that point, that we do want to ensure that there's evidence. And so, but that's not to say that we haven't invited alternative medicine specialists to our education sessions. So we certainly have done that. And I would agree with Ted. And one thing, it's funny because we just finished our annual research conference. We hold one every November, and we just concluded. And there was a well-known scientist who gave a plenary talk, and I don't know how he said it, but basically what he's saying is sometimes science is in catch-up mode. There's something that it's already out there, and we may know it, like kind of the anecdote of the parachute situation. We may already know it, it's practice out there, but the scientists haven't reached the stage of actually studying it from an evidence perspective to see if it's true or not, if there's data behind that. And I would suggest that there was some naturopathic practices that might fall under that, but not all. So I think, and IBD is such a complex disease. It's really to the individual to identify what works best for them. And I think a perfect example of that would be diet, nutrition, where for one IBD patient, one specific type of food item might be okay for them. And for another IBD patient, it's absolutely, that's what triggers their flares and so forth. And I've heard that so often. So I think this would be where that's how I think of a naturopath falls into that kind of bucket. It's such a complex disease. It's a matter of trial and error, as long as it's not something so out there that you need to really also wear your thinking cap to say, does this make sense? Or is it too extreme, a recommendation or whatnot? And I know naturopaths often work with diet and nutrition to figure out what works best for the client or whatnot. And I think that's an area that perhaps naturopaths could help with.
Okay, so Brian, I have a question for you because you wear two hats. You're a patient, but you also work at a patient advocacy organization. So how much, as a patient, how much evidence do you need to try something? So again, and I'm not talking about like, stuff that is potentially dangerous. I'm really talking more about, you find something in the health food store, you Google it, there's not a lot of strong evidence, doesn't really seem to be harmful. How much evidence do you, because you also work for a patient advocacy organization, right? So how do you straddle that?
It's a great question. Personally, early on, and I was diagnosed about 16 years ago, but I made a pact with my dad that I would give science a chance. I would give doctors a chance and every opportunity to help me feel better before I started exploring anything else. And it was just a personal thing after a lot of conversations with the people that, matter to me most in making those kinds of decisions. And I've just kind of sort of stuck to that. I'm personally certainly open to things like, dietary changes and things like that. As long as it doesn't feel like it's anything that's going to be harmful. I'm also somebody who, when I became a patient, I decided I was going to be the very best patient in the history of patients. So even when I make little changes, whether they're medical or not, but that impact my health, I want all my doctor's opinions. I won't switch a medicine that maybe my dermatologist has prescribed without also consulting with my GI and my internist and my rheumatologist. Maybe I go above and beyond, but it's just something that has been important to me and has, for the most part, served me well. As far as what we advocate for in our support groups, again, we just really encourage everybody to have those collaborative conversations with their healthcare team. It is so individual. The internet can be a scary place. Like we really discourage consulting with Dr. Google because you never know what you're going to come across. I think oftentimes the reviews, the medical sort of reviews that you find online, it's like restaurant reviews. Only the people that had a bad experience are sitting at home in front of their computer talking about their bad experience. The people that had a great time are off living their lives. So, we caution people against diving too deep online for those sorts of, for that kind of information. But yeah, personally, I just felt like it was a way of like drawing that line of knowing like, how deep am I going to go down different rabbit holes and not always in a negative way. I think just with FMT, there's incredible anecdotal evidence. It's super fascinating to me, but I had to draw a line and make a decision where I was going to go with my own treatment. And so I made a pact that I would just, give the doctors their chance to do their thing first. And I haven't yet hit the line. So that's where I am personally.
Okay, so Saffron, obviously we have to hear from you because you did try traditional methods and you did hit that point. What was going through your mind? Were you, and throughout the film, we see you asking a number of the different experts that you're interviewing, if it were you, or if it were your husband, or if it were your child, would your decision be different than the decision that than the advice that you're giving me right now as a medical doctor? And I have to say, I mean, many of them said, well, it might be different if I was in your situation, or if it was my, somebody that was a loved one. So Saffron, walk us through what caused you to finally make that decision and the risks that you considered.
Sure. I just want to say, first of all, I'm very inspired by Bria's approach to dealing with her doctor and dealing with her condition, because that's something I learned about myself through making this film. That first scene that I have with my gastroenterologist, there's so much that I don't say. And a lot of people are putting the onus on my doctor of, he didn't take you seriously. I'm like, well, I really didn't say much, to be honest. Everything I said was in subtext. I was so frustrated and spinning my own wheels, but not expressing that to him. So I don't think he was necessarily at fault. I had to learn for myself, like, wow, I really don't advocate for myself in a way that I should, based on how much I'm suffering. When it comes to what it would take for me to try an alternative treatment, I started out totally in favor of Western medicine. Like I said, I mean, I heard about fecal transplant. At the same time, I was put on medication, 5-ASA medication, which is a very typical medication for colitis. And the medicine was working. I was happy to ride that out for the entire duration of my life with ulcerative colitis. It was when it stopped working for me that I was looking at going on to a higher class of drugs like biologics. I have no problem with biologics. If I end up on biologics, I'm fine with that. It was more so that if one drug stopped working, I was afraid the next one would stop working. I was looking at the long term. From age 20 to 30, it got worse. If I try a new medication at 30 and it's not working by 40, I have a long life to live. How many medications am I going to cycle through? So that's why I decided I had to try something different. When I look at different alternative therapies, I look for clinical research. I'm more likely to try something that has maybe one small scale study that had significant results if there's no risk. If there's no risk to this supplement that's, has a small scale study, I might try it and see. Something like fecal transplant, where I knew that there was a risk, I did a lot more research. So it depends on what the risk is. And with fecal transplant, I came to a point where I felt that I was doing what I could to mitigate the risk by choosing a donor who was known to me, by speaking to multiple doctors about this. And it was also just a risk benefit analysis that I felt I was kind of running out of options.
So, Ted, I have a question for you. So fecal transplants have been approved for C. difficile. So risk in doing a fecal transplant for C. difficile be the same as doing a fecal transplant for another condition like Crohn's colitis?
You cut out there for a second. You said the risk of doing it, would it be the same?
Yes.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, so the challenge is I have a number of patients with recurrent C. diff in IBD, particularly UC, but also Crohn's colitis. That's a well-recognized association. It has to do with the inflammation in the colon changing the microbiome in a way that allows C. diff to grow, and it creates this vicious cycle. There has been a fair amount of evidence from case series that there's a risk of flaring colitis when you do an FMT. The studies have ranged from like 15 to 50%. I've seen it happen 3 times, and 2 were severe enough for the person to end up in the hospital on IV steroids. But I cured their C. diff. So it was, and at the end of the day, at least one of them was happy with the ultimate result, but it was not fun getting there. And so I do always counsel patients about that risk. Whereas with treatment for C. diff itself, you don't see that risk. And if you follow the appropriate donor screening requirements from Health Canada or the FDA, whichever jurisdiction you're in, I think the risk is extremely low. And again, as those of you who saw the film or have read about this know that we don't for C. diff, usually single treatment is effective. For IBD, probably not, and we don't actually know the appropriate dosing, duration, interval, and also the specific donor makes quite a lot of difference, and we don't yet know how to screen that. Whereas for C. diff, at pretty much any reasonable donor makes sense. So efficacy is different, and also risk is potentially different. But I would say that the risks that people have in their mind are not necessarily the actual medical risks, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that I just think it's important to define when somebody's trying something that's not supported by the research. I do think that there's a difference between, is it proven to be effective? In which case, if it's safe, but they don't know whether it works, like, why would anybody care if they took a supplement that may not work at all, might have a placebo effect, as long as there's not a risk associated with it. Would you agree with that, Kate and Ted? Just
My
advise
personal
people?
opinion, I would,
Well,
if
no,
I
I
were,
guess from Crohn's colitis opinion, like in terms of just when you're advising patients regarding, approaches or, non-traditional therapies,
right,
do you define that for them? Like, do you look at that? Because to me, it's quite a bit different. I mean, as a
yes,
healthcare consumer, I
yeah,
would want to know if there's a health risk. But
yes,
it's really up to me whether I'm going to go through the motions of trying something, and
yeah,
it may just be a waste of my time. It might be a waste of my money because it hasn't been proven to be effective. But that's a
right.
lot different than proven safe or unsafe.
I fully, yeah. So at the end of the day, it's really between a decision between the patient, and we always encourage them. I mean, I loved your approach, Brian, when you were talking, that you keep your clinicians informed of everything. And I think that's the key, so that your primary care provider has the full picture of how you are managing your disease. And so that's what we do. We encourage them to hold that discussion with the clinician, the primary care provider, so that they can be part of that discussion. And after having that discussion and feeling informed, at the end of the day, it's up to the individual to decide which way they do it. We certainly don't give them advice, because it's not our place to give them advice about these things, because it's really up to the individual to decide how are they going to manage their disease.
Okay, thank you. I just want to close on one last note, and it was an observation that I observed during the process of filming Designer Shit in interviewing some of the experts, and that was the difficulty in researchers finding people to participate in clinical trials. And what we heard from a lot of the experts was that they try to deliver information to physicians, mostly general practitioners, and general practitioners are not very good at informing their patients about potential clinical trials. And in fact, it almost sounded as though the physicians were making a decision ahead of time, like, no, my patients wouldn't be interested in that. So just really quickly, maybe I can get everybody just to comment on their thoughts on how we as a collective society can make sure that patients, the end consumer of health, are aware of clinical trials, and what can be done to make sure that they learn about that. Ted, do you want to start?
Sure, it's really important. And just the one additional barrier that I would bring up is it can be difficult to find physicians willing to participate in trials as investigators, because you don't actually get compensated for that in most reimbursement models. And so I've struggled with that a lot in my own institution, trying to find physicians who have the time to do this, but even beyond that, in terms of getting so there's a lot of work moving in this direction, and one important point is engaging patient partners in research design at the very beginning. And we did this in we had a COVID research initiative that started in 2020, and we brought on 3 experienced patient partners, and they were so valuable. And then they actually created sort of a grassroots effort to boost the importance of research, of clinical research, to the ministry in BC, and created a document called Research is Care, and have gotten a lot of resources dedicated to that, especially in research equity, so bringing research opportunities to less populated parts of the province, things like that. There's also an organization called Reach BC that can pair up potential study participants with research studies in BC, and people can actually go and sign up and say, yeah, please contact me if you hear about a study in X or Y. But I think we're a long way off from where we need to be, but I see things moving in the right direction. But I do think that having people engaged early on is really helpful. And also being really careful with populations that have been mistreated by medical research in the past, and being very aware of that. So there's a lot of education involved too.
Great, thank you. Kate, do you have any insight? Just quickly, we've got 2 minutes left, so.
Yeah, we hear that from our community as well, the clinician community that's involved in clinical trials, that it is very challenging for them. And we do, Crohn's and Colitis Canada as an organization, do our best to support recruitment using our network. Having said that, I think we could be doing more at our organization, and to I can't comment on the family practitioners. So, but in terms of the patient community, we are working towards developing resources. So rather than us, the clinicians relying on their network of patients that they take care of, they can come to us and we'll provide a broader network that they can turn to try to recruit patients for clinical trials.
Great, thank you. And Brian, how about your organization?
These kinds of collaborations are so important. I think it's just about awareness. IBD is such an isolating illness for lots of reasons, for obvious reasons, like we spend a lot of time in the bathroom by ourselves, and also because it's not something we're talking about enough in a public way. And so I just think the more opportunities for things like this to collaborate with one another, to get the researchers in front of the patients and vice versa, and everybody involved in being aware, the better for everybody in the community.
Great.
Yeah.
And Saffron, last word goes to you.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear that this is a film about DIY fecal transplant, you think I'm going to be telling other people to go do what I did, but I'm not. The lesson that I learn at the end of the film is that we have to be participating in more clinical trials. I still really believe in fecal transplant. I do believe that it worked for me, but obviously that's not enough to convince anybody. I'm looking forward to more trials that kind of show us that there's promise to this. And the only way to do that is through us all participating in clinical trials and being aware of what clinical trials are going on.
Great. Well, thank all of you so much. This has been a really interesting discussion. And I just want to close by reminding our audience that Designer Shit will be released to the general public on November 14th. It's now available for pre-sale, thank you, on our website, but also in the US on Amazon, Apple TV, and Vimeo. And if you enjoyed this panel discussion, we have 9 more scheduled that run through to the end of November. So please go to our website and check them out. They're all free of charge. And I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.